Scapulothoracic motion. How do muscles attaching to the scapula interact to control scapula position and maintain scapulohumeral rhythm? We know that there's a 2-to-1 ratio between the scapula and the glenohumeral joint. And what we want to understand here is specifically what muscles control that and are responsible for maintaining it. And to do that, we need to really be clear about which muscles are upwardly rotating the scapula and which do not. And then lastly, we know that the scapula has to maintain this rhythm when the arm is moving in the frontal plane and when the arm is moving in the sagittal plane. And so the position of the scapula obviously has to adjust from being near the spine, posteriorly on the thorax, to being abducted laterally on the thorax. So the key concepts will be actions of the muscles individually and then co-contraction that's required, and how muscles can be both a synergist in one direction and an antagonist in another. So to start off with, let's just orient to this picture of a person, muscles from a cadaver. And let's look at some of the different muscles before we draw their force vectors. Here's their spine of the scapula and the acromion out here. And so this is the inferior trap, or the lower trap. This would be considered the upper trap, and this is the middle trap. And we'll label all of those in these different diagrams. If we look at the deeper posterior upper back muscles of the shoulder girdle, we can see here, again on this deeper dissection, this is spine of the scapula. This is the superior angle here. And we can see coming off the anterior surface the levator scapulae muscle here, the rhomboid minor here, and then this would be here the rhomboids, which we could represent by force vector here. The other muscle we're going to talk about quite a bit is the serratus anterior. We can see here's the scapula here, and then these are the different attachment points of the sections of the serratus anterior muscle. We can see that you could represent each muscle group as a vector. We could also represent a single muscle vector that kind of acts in a similar direction, something like this, which would pull the medial border of the scapula into abduction and upward rotation. Okay, now we'll move to individual analysis of each muscle. Okay, let's start with the trapezius muscle. So let's draw its different components. So we have the upper trap force vector. We have the middle trap force vector. And then we have the lower trap force vector. So we can label each force vector here. And then if we break each one down, we can see that every single one, every force vector draws the scapula medially, where this is medial and then this is lateral. Spine of the scapula, the glenoids here. And so we can see that each force vector has a component here that's medial. So all of the components of the trap have an action in adduction of the scapulothoracic joint. Now, different parts, though, also do different things, and so we know that the scapulothoracic also elevates and depresses. So the upper trap, so we put here all parts, and then if we have elevation, we basically have the upper trap, because that is a component upward. And then if we have depression, basically that would be the lower trap. Right? And then the middle trap is agnostic to elevation and depression. But the more difficult one to kind of for people to imagine is how the different components act in terms of upward rotation. And so for this one, it really depends on where you put the axis point. So I want to put the axis point here. Okay, what it's going to show you is that basically there's a perpendicular for middle trap. There's the perpendicular distance of the moment arm for the upper trap. And then here's the perpendicular distance for the lower trap, meaning that all three muscles turn the scapula in the same direction, and it's this direction, which is upward rotation. And so essentially upward rotation is really a function of all of the fibers, but there's some debate about the middle trap because we don't actually know where the axis is. And so if I put the axis here right in line with the vector, then there wouldn't be much of a role of the middle trap. But in essence, it doesn't downwardly rotate. And so essentially you get this kind of upward rotation effect from all of the fibers, but it's more the upper trap and lower trap that are clearly upward rotators. Okay, and then in terms of the only other two motions that we've left out are abduction and downward rotation. And the trap doesn't contribute to those. 0 and 0. Okay, so let's now consider the rhomboids and levator scapulae. So let's draw their attachment sites. We know that the levator scapulae is coming off the anterior surface of this superior angle of the scapula, and it attaches to the neck, cervical vertebrae. And so let's put the force vector here, the levator scapulae, and we know that the rhomboid major and minor are coming off this medial border to the spine. And so we'll draw them the less acute angle, and we'll represent both the major and minor as one force vector here, and we'll label it the force in the rhomboids. So now let's do the same kind of analysis where we look at where their force vectors are going to lie relative to the axis of the scapula. So the axis of the scapula has got to be somewhere around here, same place we kind of drew it last time. So if we project this, we can see there's a moment arm here, and there's a moment arm here, that essentially the very first motion we can see happening is that it's going to cause it's going to cause a downward rotation of the scapula in this direction. And so we can see that both of these have a downward rotation. So we have levator scapulae and the rhomboids here. So we can see we have the levator scapulae and the rhomboids here, but not upward rotation, so that would be a 0. We can also see that there's a force vector component of this force vector here, and in this direction, the angles here. Okay, and so both of those are going to adduct, and so we have levator scapulae and rhomboids are both adductors. We can also see there's a component up or superiorly from both force vectors, and so both of them are going to be elevators. Okay, but they don't have any depression component, and they can abduct. So then our inventory is done there for the levator scapulae and the rhomboids. Okay, so now let's consider the serratus anterior muscle. So we know the serratus anterior muscle comes on the anterior surface here, so kind of doing a dotted line all along this medial border. And the fibers are running down to the ribs, and so we could kind of draw it something like this, because it's running on the insert, so it's going to each several different ribs. But rather than have all of these different arrows, let's just represent it as one arrow and just do a representative force vector of all those different angles, those individual muscle components. And let's put some vector, something like this. Call that the force in the serratus anterior. And then if we do that, we can kind of look here and see, wow, this has a couple unique moment arms here. So if we kind of go down here, we can start to identify its rotation component first. And it's pretty clear that for at least most of the fibers, it's going to have a strong upward rotation component. Now, it's also clear that all these fibers are pulling the scapula laterally, and so it's also going to have a very strong abduction component. Okay, but it can't adduct, that's clear, and it can't downwardly rotate, although some of these superior fibers, it's unclear what their action might be selectively. Now, in terms of depression or elevation, it's kind of ambiguous, right? Because it's like some of the angle maybe if the scapula were elevated, it might pull down a little bit, or if it's depressed, they could pull up. But they're fairly agnostic to these superior inferior direction. So the key function of the serratus anterior seems to be abduction and upward rotation. Okay, what we want to do now is ask how these different scapulothoracic muscles control the scapula position during an abduction, upper extremity elevation during when the shoulder is in abduction, so it's frontal plane of the body, and then how that differs from flexion when the motions in the upper extremity elevations into the sagittal plane of the body. So let's orient ourselves first here to this picture so we can understand what the challenge is. And so here we've kind of drawn a representation of the thorax. This is anterior here, and posterior, you can see the little itty-bitty vertebrae there. And here's a representation of the scapula in the position it would need to, with the glenoids kind of facing in the frontal plane. Here's the AC joint here for abduction. And so this is where it would sit, so it would be fairly retracted. Now, when you flex, what will have to happen is the shoulder girdle or the scapula has to slide anteriorly around the thorax, and so it has to kind of do something like this, right? And so in the end, it has to be abducted, okay? So those are our two extremes, and then basically if you weren't fully in the frontal plane or retracted, or you didn't have your scapulothoracic joint adducted, you wanted to move between the frontal plane and the sagittal plane of the body, you would have to hold the scapula between those two positions. So let's look at how that might work out in terms of control. So we'll start with abduction, and then we'll do flexion, and then we'll look at how that would work for the in-between position. So we think about the upper trap. The upper trap basically adducts the scapula, and so it would be ideal to position the scapula into pull the clavicle, the SC joint, into a retracted position and provide a base for upward rotation to occur when the scapula is adducted. And so we can kind of draw those vectors here. So we have force of the upper trap, force of the lower trap, and then the middle trap. So those are all in play when the scapulothoracic joint is adducted to provide a base for abduction of the glenohumeral joint. The rhomboids and the levators are not on because they downwardly rotate even though they adduct. Okay, and the serratus anterior is not on because it also abducts and upwardly rotates. but essentially the upward rotation and adduction of the scapula at the scapulothoracic joints handled by the trap in a when the frontal plane motion is occurring. Okay, so let's now look at what happens during flexion. So during flexion now we need the scapula to be slid anteriorly on the thorax, so it sits over this range here. And so essentially what we need is something that abducts the scapula and upwardly rotates. Well, that muscle will then be the serratus anterior. And so the serratus anterior in full flexion can handle that, but not the trap, because the trap would in turn adduct the scapula, and we don't really need that. Okay, so again, the rhomboids and the levator downwardly rotate, and so they are not really helpful. Now, if we want to hold the scapula in an in-between position, we need some kind of co-contraction, because essentially if the trap's completely unopposed, it'll just kind of slam back up against the spine of the scapula. And if the serratus anterior is unopposed, it really can't halfway contract. It's going to just draw the scapula into the sternum. Okay, so what we need is some co-contraction between the trapezius muscle and the serratus anterior to hold the scapula between a fully frontal plane position for glenohumeral motion and a fully sagittal plane position in flexion. And so here we would have basically the trapezius muscle contracting and the serratus co-contracting to hold that scapula position. And notice that they're all synergists for upward rotation. So basically the serratus anterior and the trap all have that synergistic action for upward rotation, but yet they are antagonists for abduction and adduction. So that's how the coordination between some of the scapular muscles can work to hold the scapula in a mid position between frontal plane and sagittal plane motion for movement at the glenohumeral joint.